everyone. This is Dana Smith of Exalt Resources, and I'm so delighted that you're joining me today for the Top 10 Employee Handbook Blunders. This is a repost of a webinar that we did back in early February, so I hope that you enjoy the content. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Employee Handbook Blunder number 10. We're going to go all the way down to number 1. Oftentimes, business owners will ask me, Dana, do I really have to have an employee handbook? I've heard that I don't really need one. And my answer to them is this. What if you were driving and there was just total disregard for the rules of the road? You've had people stopping when they should go and they're going when they should stop. Very much, in fact, like this picture that we see here. We would have chaos. We've had gridlock. We would not be able to get from one place to another. And just as Peter Drucker says, the only things that evolve by themselves in an organization are disorder, friction, and malperformance. And so without an employee handbook, without written procedures or actually policies on how you're going to operate your organization, you have chaos. Your employees, they don't know what's expected of them. Therefore, there's no accountability for how they perform at work. So yes, you should definitely have an employee handbook. Some of the risks of operating without one include, obviously, increased liability of lawsuits. We talked about no performance expectation and no accountability. But then there's also inconsistent communication and application of policy, because your policy is not anywhere written, it's in someone's head, and then you can't guarantee that you're applying it correctly every time. And when you don't apply your policy equitably and correctly, that leads to unfair work practices and discrimination. Okay, so you definitely want to have an employee handbook. That leads us to Employee Handbook Blunder number 9. This way to human resources. I love that picture. This way to HR. And a man who represents himself has a fool for a client. That was by Dear Abe Lincoln. And so one of the other blunders I see is allowing or creating an employee handbook without having an HR person do that for you, or even an attorney. But if you don't have the expertise or the knowledge to put that handbook together, for one, you're unable to discern between what policies are optional and should be in your handbook, or what policies are required and should be in your handbook, versus those that are optional and maybe don't apply so much to your actual operations and that you may want to consider leaving out. I can always tell a handbook that's been put together by a non-HR person because it's far too long. They put in the entire kitchen sink because they don't realize that they don't have to put everything in the handbook. But more importantly than that, if you've ever tried to put together a handbook and you're not an HR person, you have found out right away that it is a very long process if you aren't sure what you're doing. So definitely always have an HR person put together your handbook. Employee Handbook Blunders number 8 and number 7. Let's start with number 8, and I kind of alluded to it in that previous slide. You don't want to have a handbook that's too long. 100 pages, ladies and gentlemen, that's too long for a handbook. Do you think your employee's really going to read a 100-page handbook? Now, I actually might, and that's unusual. Well, I just like owner's manual, so that's just my thing. When I buy something, I actually read the owner's manual from cover to cover. But most people are not like that. I understand that that's strange, and they're not going to read a handbook that's 100 pages. You can probably barely get them to read it if it's 30 pages. So you don't want it to be that long. If your handbook's 100 pages, that means it's far too specific, and you are using it as a procedures manual and not just a record of your policies. And by that I mean you've probably thrown in step-by-step procedures for how to process a business expense reimbursement, and that's not what you want to have in your handbook. Employee Handbook Blunder number 7 is what I see is there are not enough disclosures in the handbook. So that handbook should have disclosures all through it. You should have an at-will statement within the first few pages of your handbook. You should have it again at the end. You definitely want to have a disclaimer on you have a right to revise the handbook at any time. And you definitely want to have an acknowledgement page on your handbook, and we're going to talk about that further in our next few slides. So let's keep moving on all the way down to number 1. But before we get there, we'll stop off at Employee Handbook Blunder number 6. Social networking. So social networking, right? It's the new frontier, and it has completely changed the way so many of us communicate one into another, whether we're Facebooking or tweeting or we're on LinkedIn or a variety of online communities. Many of your employees are engaged in this in their personal lives outside of the office. Now, the problem is that does not necessarily stop when they come back to work, when they walk through your doors to start their day. Many of them are Facebooking right on your company computer, or they're tweeting on their cell phones during work hours. So it's critical that you have a social networking policy in your employee handbook. And that policy should definitely talk about that there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in the workplace. It should also talk about unauthorized use of the employer's resources and equipment. So you don't allow folks to use a company computer to Facebook. And if they are, they should have absolutely no expectation of privacy. If they're using company internet, DSL, T1 line, no privacy there. And you also want to monitor. The reason you want to have a social networking policy is because what we're seeing in our office is a larger increase in sexual harassment claims that are not physically tied to the office. So it's a completely different ballgame now, where people are making complaints of harassment, and they're saying, this person, they've texted me, or they've friended me on Facebook, and they're saying some really aggressive stuff on the Facebook or on the post. And so now, where we have worked so hard in HR to make sure the office environment is safe, we have to make sure we have a strong social networking policy to address those things that occur outside of the office, but within the online community. Employee Handbook Blunder number 5 and number 4. Let's start with number 5, which is state versus federal laws. For those of you who are doing business in the state of California, it's tough sometimes to do business in the state of California, but what this means for the handbook is that we have federal requirements that we are required to follow, but we also have requirements from the state, and sometimes those two requirements, they don't work in concert with each other. And so you've got to make sure that your handbook addresses not only your federal requirements, but also your state requirements. So if you've created a handbook in the past based upon a template, if that was a national-based template, 9 times out of 10, your handbook is not compliant because you don't have specific laws or policies that should be in your handbook that pertain to your particular state, and in this case, referring to California. Now, I mentioned earlier about employee acknowledgement page. That's really key. So you've got your entire handbook, and then you have that employee acknowledgement page at the very end. That acknowledgement should definitely say, have the employee sign off that they have received the handbook and that they agree to read it. It should have an at-will statement in it as well. The most important thing, and what I don't see for the employee handbook, is the employer hands it out, but they don't get that signed acknowledgement. That's very, very important. You want to have a signed employee acknowledgement sheet for every employee in your organization, whether they're full-time or part-time, whether they're temporary or regular. You want to have that signed acknowledgement, and you're going to need it for a variety of reasons. One, it allows you to hold an employee accountable to your policies and procedures. You can always demonstrate that they were made aware of them. And you're going to want to use that in unemployment claims, particularly if you have to let someone go because they violated a policy. That's the first thing you want to be sending to the unemployment office. This employee was aware of the policy. Well, how do you know that? I know that because they signed this acknowledgement form. All kind of reasons why you want to have that acknowledgement form. Make sure every employee, in fact, go back through your files, and if you do a file audit and you don't have a signed employee acknowledgement form for an employee, go and get it. Employee Handbook Blunder number 3. This one reminds me of good old apple pie. did you remember to roll out your employee handbook? So let's say you've done an excellent job. You've decided that you are going to get an employee handbook for your organization. You have an HR person put it together. You don't fool around and spend countless hours doing it on your own. It's just right in size. It's not 100 pages too long. You've ensured that you've got all the proper disclaimers in that handbook. You've got a strong social networking policy. Your handbook is applicable to not only federal but state laws as well. You have the acknowledgement form and you're ready to go, but I think one of the important things you could do is roll out that handbook to your employees. What do I mean by rolling it out, Dana? What I mean is, rather than just handing it to your staff, having them complete the acknowledgement form and getting that back in, have a meeting with your staff. And at that meeting, the expectation is not that you read all 40 pages of your handbook, but what you should be doing is highlighting the big ticket items, those core policies that are in your handbook. And that's going to be things like sexual harassment. It's going to be things like overtime, exempt versus non-exempt. It's going to be leave of absence. What are your leave of absence policy? What are your time off policies in terms of holiday pay, how that's handled? Those types of things. You want to go over those things in a meeting. The other advantage of rolling out your handbook in a meeting with your staff is that if you have some global issues happening in your organization, for instance, you just notice people are kind of taking advantage of the time that they're supposed to arrive, and they're coming in a little late, 3 minutes here, 4 minutes here, 5 minutes there. It's a great way to make a general reminder and statement about attendance and punctuality in your organization. So there are many, many benefits for actually rolling out that handbook anytime you're creating one for the first time or that you are updating an existing handbook. Well, we're almost to employee handbook blunder number 1, but before we get there, we've got to make a stop off at blunder number 2, and I ask you, is your handbook legally compliant? So this is a very important step. You see, we have our gavel there and we have a law book, but the law book is upside down. It needs a little help. It needs to be resuscitated. And what I mean by this, it's important that you have an HR person put that handbook together for you, but you do want to have it reviewed by legal counsel or ensure that that handbook begins with a legally compliant template and that you're just modifying it or updating it for your organizations. Because misunderstandings or misstatements can create a huge legal liability for your business. So it's important that you take that final step on that handbook. And finally, employee handbook blunder number 1, drum roll please. An outdated employee handbook is no good. Pew, it stinks. So if you have a handbook and you put it in place 10 years ago, it's out of date. You want to get that puppy updated right away. And going forward, there are some key milestones where you always want to be renewing or updating actually your employee handbook. Anytime you're going from under 50 to over 50 employees, that should trigger you to make sure that your handbook is updated. In fact, if you haven't updated your handbook, even in the last 2 years, there have been some pretty sweeping changes to things like FMLA and ADA, which require that you have updated policies in your handbook. And I would recommend that you update your handbook at minimum every 3 years. It's really a good amount of time to do that. So everyone, we've come to the end of our rebroadcast of our Employee Handbook Blunders webinar. I'm so happy that you were able to join us today. If after this training you say, oh my goodness, I do not want to do this handbook, we would be more than happy to do it for you. You can contact us at Exalt Resources. Our phone number is 562-920-2853. And again, my name is Dana Smith. Have a terrific day.